Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's Part 4 video in the Mystery Amp series. In today's installment, we will continue our saga of how to convert some old aluminum plate, some miscellaneous electronic components, some leather, and some wood into what will hopefully turn out to be a nice amplifier. Today's installment will focus on the completion of the wooden cabinet and the covering of it with the leatherette material, and also the completion of the chassis and the wiring of the chassis. In our fifth and final installment, we're going to install the tubes and test the chassis thoroughly to make sure that everything is operating correctly. Then we'll install it in the cabinet, plug in a guitar, plug the amp into a current limiter, and test it. And then we'll find out if there really is a difference between a triode and pentode input stage. But for today's episode, let's get started on the wiring and covering of our amplifier. All right, I've started wiring the chassis. I bring the main power cord through the grommet, come in, ground the green wire by bolting it down to one of the transformer studs, connect the white wire to the white primary of the power transformer. The black wire I bring over here to the on-off switch, come out of the on-off switch to the fuse, and then from the fuse through the black primary lead to the transformer. Next, we will wire our rectifier socket. If you notice the slot here that indexes the tube and make sure that it goes in right is where we start our counting of our pins. From the slot going clockwise, the first pin that is clockwise from the slot is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Therefore, this is an octal base. The red high voltage wires will go to pin 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. The 5-volt leads will go to pin 2 and 8. The center tap is bolted to a transformer lead just like the green power cord ground. And the center tap, as is usual with center taps, is the base color of the wires that it is the center tap to, but it has a yellow line on it. So the red-yellow wire is the center tap, which we ground to the chassis. The blue transformer lead is for your grid bias voltage, which we don't need for this circuit, so I cut it off flush, wrapped it around, and then did some heat shrink to make sure it doesn't touch anything and get in trouble. So in just a matter of a very few minutes, we've reduced that big wad of wire that was connected to our power transformer to properly wired connections, nice and neat, and we're left with the 6.3 volt filament wires, which will be next for us to connect. Also, before I forget, all 3 pairs of wires that come out of our transformer will be carrying alternating current, so we twist them around each other to keep them in close proximity. They are out of phase, so the wires, when they are close like this, will neutralize each other's electromagnetic field. This then will reduce the hum in the amplifier. So I will now twist these wires and then install them first to my pilot light and then to the filaments of my other 5 tubes. Here's a helpful little hint. If you don't have a pair of pliers like this for stripping wire, you need to get them. Because watch, you put the wire in the proper gauge hole, squeeze the handle, perfectly stripped, ready to go. Here's another helpful hint, the RCA triple Pindex. If you have trouble like I do remembering all the pins and what they connect to on every vacuum tube, this is a dandy little book. It shows you about every tube you've ever heard of, and you can open it up so that you have 3 different selected tubes on one page. Say you're wiring a 6V3, a 6A3, and a 5V3. You have all there. Now you could probably find one of these on eBay, and it's a great help. Well, the filament circuit is finished. You notice the twisted green wires go to the pilot light and then all 6 of the tube bases, and that's twisted to neutralize the electromagnetic field that might cause hum. The wire arches up and over and comes down into each tube socket instead of laying here and wrapping around. This seems to work better. Once again, it causes less hum to have the wires arch like this. This is my least favorite part of wiring any amp because it's such a fussy job, but now that it's done, the rest is going to be fun. Also, I wired the output transformer leads to the speaker jack, and I put in a little extra feature here. When there's no jack in place and the arm here is against the leaf, it activates an 8 ohm 10 watt resistor. So if you accidentally forget to plug in your speaker or something pulls the speaker plug out, you'll be safe for a while because this is like a ballast resistor here, and it will protect your output. Time for a wiring update. I decided to put the 6v6s at the rear of the chassis and have the triode and pentode up at the front of the chassis. It just seemed to make more sense so that the preamp tubes could be closer to the input jacks and their own volume controls. And I pretty well finished wiring the output tubes. I had to drill and rivet in a terminal strip right here to help to hold some of the components. And then I screwed in a pair of terminal strips up here which will help with this row of tubes and with the controls. I've also pretty well finished the wiring here on the phase inverter, the 6N7. If you notice, my wire wound resistors are all laying flat against the aluminum chassis simply because aluminum is the greatest heat sink in the world. I would guess that laying against aluminum would just about double the wattage capacity of these resistors. I've also added my 2 100 ohm virtual center tap resistors. They're connected up here on the pilot light lugs, which is probably the best place to tie into this filament circuit. The reason for them is that the filament circuit from this transformer had no center tap. So I had to make a virtual center tap. Here's another helpful hint. Whenever you're installing components like resistors or capacitors that have bare leads, and you want to be sure that they don't inadvertently come in contact with any other metal object or wire in the circuit, simply strip off insulation from some of your regular wire and slide that insulation up the legs so that now they will be protected. Here's helpful hint number 986. When you're dealing with metal tubes, which are very early types of tubes, like we are in this build, the metal shield is over a glass tube that's inside. Inside of this shield, there is a glass tube that looks sort of like a normal vacuum tube. Here's the trick. This shield is connected to pin number 1. So if you ground that socket position in the chassis, you are grounding the shield and reducing hum. It's generally pin 1, not always, but check your tube chart and ground the pin that connects to your metal shield. Here's another hint. If you need shielded cable and don't think you have any, I'll bet you do have it. If you've got cables like this, and I think most of us do have a bunch of these laying around, old audio and video cables, just strip off the yellow insulation in this case and wrap all of the copper shielding wires into a little pigtail and then strip the extended end of the central wire, and now you've got your signal cable and you've got your shield. You can solder both of these into your circuit and have shielded cable for nothing. Here's Jack enjoying his morning dose of methadone-laced catnip. Unlike most cats who sniff and roll in it, he eats it. But those of us addicted to old amplifiers can understand what addiction is like. Well, the wiring is all complete here in the chassis. I'm going to take the camera off the tripod and we'll go through it up close and in detail and discuss some of the changes and other aspects of it. I would like to also mention that thanks to Tommy Foley, we have a really nice schematic for this modified circuit, and I will put the link to it in the video description. I moved the 250 ohm bias resistor that you saw previously from this position over here and put a precision 5-watt pot in series with it so that I could have adjustable tube bias. As I told you before, I moved the 6C5 and 6J7 up to the front and moved the output tubes to the rear so that these fellows here, the preamp tubes, could communicate easily with the input jacks and the volume controls with short leads. I used shielded leads for each of the tone pot and the two volume controls. A rather unique lead is this one from the input leaf of the pentode input jack. You see a large, heavy shielded cable passing through the chassis. And it emerges here with a porcelain grid cap that's spring-loaded to lock on here to the cap at the top of our 6J7 pentode tube. Back in the old days, instead of wiring the grids underneath, they wired them up at the top. I can only think that their plan was to keep the sensitive input signal from having to associate with all the voltages that are found around the pin base. While I'm up here, you'll see that I have labeled all of the tube sockets so there's no confusion, and also the 8 ohm speaker output jack. And on the control panel, just to keep things simple, I labeled the triode input and volume, pentode input and volume, tone, and add a little fun with the on-off switch. Also, you'll see this hole that's been drilled through the control panel, and once we look at the cabinet, I think you'll see why. This is what holds the chassis into the cabinet. Well, that's about it then for the chassis wiring. My advice to you is keep your components that associate with each other as close as possible. Keep everything away from the power transformer as far as you can. Use the shortest leads you can, and use shielded leads when they're up here standing up like antennas. I like to shield them. You only shield them on one end. In other words, you do the little pigtail and only solder the shield at one end, not at both. In our next video, I'm going to plug in the tubes. We'll fire it up, literally, probably, and do some voltage testing, and then we'll slide it into the cabinet and hook up a guitar and see how it sounds. Now let's take a look at the cabinet. Okay, let's take a look at the cabinet. I turned it face up to the light so you could see this really interesting lizard grain covering that I put on it. And then I did a contrasting stripe that goes around the top and the bottom in crocodile type of covering. So we have dueling reptiles here. And also, since I did the aluminum chassis, I thought, why not polish up some aluminum bars and do an Art Deco grill work here in front of the speaker. As you can see, the crocodile stripe continues around over the top of the case. And here I am using a new handle. It's a luggage style handle, or like the type you see on a lot of guitar cases. I got really sick of those leather hammock handles that you try to grab and they pinch your fingers and they're very uncomfortable. We'll see how this one works. Okay, then the stripe also continues down across the bottom of the cabinet, and you'll see there's 4 lovely new rubber feet, courtesy of Home Depot. One other feature I'm proud of is there are absolutely no screw heads, bolt heads, or anything else showing on the front of the baffle or through the grill cloth. Now let's take a look at the inside of the cabinet. I added a cleat all the way around the perimeter of the upper inside of the cabinet so that the back door could connect. You see that I used screws and bolts to hold the handle on. I don't like just using wood screws because it might pull out. The handle might come off and this thing could, fall 12 stories and kill an orphan or something. So to prevent such a catastrophe, I find that screws and bolts like this are always better. Here's those world famous Wingnuts holding in the baffle. And as you can see, the leather material is wrapped around and secured tightly so that it can't come loose. I was really proud of my corners. I thought they came out nice. And also this then is the bracket with a hole and a silver soldered nut on the back here, so that when the chassis slides in, you put in one machine screw through the bottom into this and it will be locked into the cabinet for, or at least until the amp chassis catches fire and the fire department rips it out of the cabinet and throws it in the neighbor's swimming pool. Next, we've got the back door. It's covered in that same black lizard grain material. I went ahead and put some of the grill cloth over the vent holes just for a little elegant touch. And then, as you can see, the material is wrapped around and very securely attached to the back of the door. The door then fits in firmly in the back, snug as can be, and you screw in the 5 screws with the countersinking washers, and it also reinforces the top with this 5th screw. Okay, I'll do one last walk around here so you can get an idea of how it looks. I think for a combo amp containing a 12-inch speaker, it's really rather small, and I like that. It's very compact and rather light. I haven't put it on the scales yet, but I intend to do so. And I'm pleased with this handle. I think this is going to work out pretty well. Let's take a look at the back now. And here's the back of the cabinet. We have our speaker jack, anxiously awaiting the insertion into the 8-ohm output jack on the chassis. We have our bracket here that can't wait for that little screw to go in and hold the chassis in place. We have the grooves waiting for the ears of the chassis to slide in place. And what we'll do then in our next episode, which is our final part of this 5-part series, will be to install the tubes, plug in the chassis, and with a current limiter, of course, start it up, check the voltages, check the current, make sure everything's working right, check the tube bias, and then install it in the cabinet, plug in our speaker, plug in a guitar, and see how it sounds. And we will be able to then compare the inputs of the triode and the pentode channels. For now, however, why don't we take a ride in a nice old 1936 Chevrolet pickup. Today's video is going to feature the 36 Chevy truck that you've probably seen glimpses of in some of my previous videos. It was converted into a hot rod many years ago and still has sort of a vintage hot rod look, with the wide white walls, the wheels painted to match the flames, and the beauty rings and center cap hubcaps. The body is straight as an arrow without any traces of rust. The paint is showing some of its age, but overall it's very acceptable. All steel with a full bed tonneau cover. The suspension, front and rear, came from a '62 Chevy Nova. It combines the original leaf springs with coil-over shocks. It has 308 gears, so it's great on the highway. Built-in tail lights, Chevy emblem on the tailgate, and flame pinstriping. Next, I'll show a few views of the original striping. I really like the pattern. It's kind of that early Von Dutch style of pinstriping. Here's another example on the radiator shell, and also the lining on the ridges here on the hood. The interior has all the original instruments. The speedometer works, but it also has a instrument cluster that is a wee bit more reliable. It's got the original style shifter, but it's operating a 700R4 Chevrolet transmission. Nice pinstriping on the dash, Grant steering wheel, and a nice big auto gauge tack. I made an unusual roller bearing type of accelerator pedal that I really like. It rolls under your foot and is just smooth as glass. The front has independent A-arm suspension from the '62 Chevy Nova. The engine is an original Chevrolet 283, probably from the same '62 Nova. Got the ram's horn exhaust, aluminum high-rise Edelbrock manifold, 4-barrel carburetor, and air cleaner. Got a giant electric fan with a shroud up against a custom-built Ron Davis all-aluminum radiator. The end result is this thing runs so cool, especially in the winter, that it doesn't get much above 135 degrees or so. So actually, you know, in most hot rods, heat is an issue, but not in this one. I put 2 spun aluminum gas tanks in the bed of the truck. This is the main tank, and that's the reserve tank. I then put an electrical switch here that can select up is the main tank, down is the reserve tank. So if I decide to go on a long trip, then gasoline is really not an issue. Nor is speed in this. It can travel about 80 miles an hour in the freeway all day long with no problems. Okay, let's start it up and see how it sounds. Got a pretty nasty exhaust note here from these rectangular stainless steel exhaust tips. On the other hand, the engine's as smooth and quiet as can be. Okay, let's close the hood and go for a little ride. Okay, here we go. Now, even with 308 gears, it still gets up and hauls pretty darn well because of the lightness of the car. The brakes are all modern, and it stops just as well as it goes. I'm going to turn off the camera now so I don't hit this trailer. It also has power steering, so it's easier to steer than you would imagine. Let's try a test stop here. Well, if there'd been a pedestrian, we probably wouldn't have been arraigned for murder. Go back into the driveway and say good. Well, that's about it for our little tour and ride in the 1936 Chevy truck. I hope you enjoyed it, as well as the electronics video that accompanied it, and that you will stay tuned for future videos. Thank you.